The Lord of the Rings, debunking the backlash against non-white actors in Amazon's new adaptation. So it continues. There are still people trying to argue that it's perfectly fine to change people's work to suit your own agenda. This has failed in spectacular fashion with the works of j.r.r. Tolkien, because part of the appeal of his works are their cultural influences, namely Western European influences. People like medieval-based fantasy, look at Elden Ring, and trying to brand that as bad or racist won't make people like it less. Neither will arguing that fantasy stories need to be grounded in modern politics. This has proved to be a weak argument that none of the people making it can defend. They seem to think that if they keep repeating it, changing the argument ever so slightly here and there, people won't notice what they're doing or talking about, and somehow their argument will suddenly make sense. This is how we get this article from Dimitra Fimi and Mariano Rios Maldonado, claiming to debunk the backlash against Amazon's The Rings of Power. This is specifically about the racial changes made to the show and how they don't match Tolkien's works. Their initial defense of the changes was this, quote, "First, these are imaginary creatures which are not always clearly described in the original books. Tolkien was more interested in the metaphysical than biological questions." I went over this in previous videos, so I'm not going to rehash it here, but in short, that's a lie. Tolkien describes his characters from their heights to their hair color to their skin color. Every detail of every character isn't intricately laid out for readers, and it'd be ridiculous to think any author would have to do that. Some give short descriptions that give a general idea of what the character looks like. Sometimes authors don't describe the characters at all, but readers can still figure out the character's appearance based on context. This is why this argument that, quote, "There is some evidence of dark-skinned elves and hobbits in drafts of the Silmarillion and the prologue of Lord of the Rings," doesn't fly. For one, Tolkien mentioned brown, not necessarily dark skin, and two, this isn't describing African or Indian people, but instead Caucasians who have darker skin tones or possibly a tan. You have to look at the context of the world he created, not twist that context to be whatever you want it to be. Unless you don't actually care about the context. Quote, "Second, even if Tolkien had specified that all elves, dwarves, and hobbits were white, it still wouldn't matter." Who didn't see that coming? I know the woke left likes to think this is a good argument, but it's not, because if it doesn't matter what the author wrote, then why do you want to change it? By your own admission, adapting a work changes its intention, context, and meaning. Quote, "Adaptations are original cultural products that can imitate, question, rewrite, or interpret source materials in various ways. Each adaptation is a new text, and each is an opportunity to update outdated and unacceptable tropes, and find ways to represent and normalize non-white characters." Wouldn't the same thing apply to Tolkien's work? Wouldn't changing elements of the story to remove references to European culture and folklore fundamentally change the nature of the work? The article mentions a black actor playing Prometheus in a modern version of the Greek tragedy Prometheus Bound, arguing, quote, "This version of the play presented audiences with a black Prometheus in chains, bringing to mind images of slavery, adding a further layer of complexity to the titan who suffered for humanity." And by doing that, it changes the meaning of the character's experience and strips away the cultural context and relevance, in this case, understanding how the ancient Greeks viewed humanity. You can argue that this is a different version, but if someone wants to understand ancient Greek culture, how does refocusing the story on the black slave experience do that? This is the problem with this argument. You're claiming that race doesn't matter to the story, and then claiming that it does matter when you want to change something. You can't have it both ways. If race doesn't matter, then you no longer have a reason to alter the work. If it does matter, then this would apply to Tolkien's work. So of course, the article tries to disprove this by quoting someone directly and then claiming they didn't say what they said. The article states, quote, "But some believe Tolkien was writing a mythology for England and used myths and texts from Germanic cultures that had nothing to do with people of color. However, Tolkien never actually referred to his own work in this way. This phrase was introduced by his biographer, Humphrey Carpenter. In a 1951 letter to a potential editor, Milton Waldman, Tolkien stated that he had intended to dedicate his work to England, but in the same letter also wrote that he wanted to leave space for other minds and hands to contribute to his mythology." Okay, here's an idea. If you're gonna make that claim, don't link to an article with the letter, because some intellectually dishonest person like me, who's always wrong when he doesn't accept your agenda, might read that letter and disagree with your bullshit conclusion, or as you might say, have a bad take. From Tolkien's letter, quote, Do not laugh, but once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had in mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and the cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story. The larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backfloss, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, and still less the East. And, while still possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things, it should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for a more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. I would draw in some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Now, did he explicitly state the exact words, "I made this to replace the lost lore of England"? No. Does his letter imply that the stories were based on Western European culture and folklore? Yes. He literally tells you that he intended to draw on Western European folklore, to base the stories in the lands of Western Europe, not the Mediterranean or the East, and to give everything a Celtic flair. And you're over here saying he didn't say that when you literally just quoted him saying that. Yes, he writes it off as being absurd, but that's more of him saying that it was silly for him to have such a lofty idea, not that this wasn't his intention. It's like you think you're cleverer than you actually are, to the point that you think you can quote the man saying exactly what you claim he didn't say and still claim he didn't say it, and think people with functioning brains are actually going to buy that. But that's not the best part. The best part is Carl F. Hofstadter. Some of you might recognize the name. He's the guy who edited The Nature of Middle-earth, the latest Tolkien book containing Tolkien's notes about the biology of the elves, dwarves, and men. You know, that thing that the authors of the article claimed Tolkien was less interested in than the metaphysical. Hundreds of pages. Didn't really care about it. Hofstadter comes in and just wrecks the authors, taking them to task for their nonsense argument that Tolkien essentially made all the good guys white and all the villains non-white. Quote, "The faces of Middle-earth are invariably non-white, non-European." Invariably? Oh? Feanor's sons, Turin, Eöl, Thingol, Ar-Pharazôn, Saruman, Denethor. And then there's this. It was Sam's first view of the battle of men against men, and he did not like it much. He was glad that he could not see the dead face. He wondered what the man's name was, and where he came from, and if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would rather have stayed there, in peace. Then he hit him again, quote, "In fact, in the second age in which the series is set, and at the thematic heart of the history of that age, Sauron seduces the very epitome of the white European-style peoples of Middle-earth, the Númenóreans. Many Númenóreans, even prior to Sauron's influence, became arrogant and oppressive colonizers, and by the fall of Númenor had committed many supremely evil deeds. Oh, but he wasn't done with them by a damn sight. He got medieval on their asses." Quote, "Is Tolkien's supposedly stark moral line, as claimed here, drawn along racial lines, i.e. pigmentation, which of course has nothing at all to do with race, or is it perhaps the case that it is drawn along geographical lines, due to closeness to contact with the migratory elves? In other words, is it possible that Tolkien thought that the Easterlings and the Southrons were more susceptible to Sauron's corrupting influence not because of the color of their skin, but rather because of their separation from elves, which in fact in late writings Tolkien faults the Valar for causing? And if so, isn't it just projection and confirmation bias to attribute the situation to racism?" And then we get his original comment, which I saved for last. He says, quote, "I think it would be great if certain Tolkien scholars could discern and credit Tolkien for the subtlety and nuance that he clearly possessed and expressed as a writer and thinker, instead of projecting their own ideas of what a man of his time must have thought and believed. Really, reading Tolkien in an informed and charitable light, i.e. giving him the benefit of the doubt by accepting all that he said in light of what we can know of his upbringing and beliefs, it's very clear that he was not racist as regards to the world of the 20th century, nor is he racist as regards to his fictive prehistory. He does have a firm moral stand as regards to both histories, but that stance has nothing at all to do with race. His moral stance is open to anyone of any race, and it was rejected by many, even of the supposed superior race, in his fictive world, just as it is in ours. If you thereby want to indict Tolkien as a moralist, well then, guilty as charged. But charging him as racist, you're really just rejecting his moral beliefs, and implying that no other races share those beliefs. Which, well, just look at Africa. And when their ashes settled, one of the authors of the article offered this response, quote, "The main objective of this piece is to contest the notion that people of color either do not belong in Middle-earth or should play no other roles than Easterlings and Southrons. The question of whether Tolkien was racist, personally in terms of his own ideological stance and attitudes, is a different one from whether his mythology reproduced harmful racial stereotypes and tropes, some of which were commonly also reproduced, as well as contested by many progressive writers of his generation. There is also a wealth of scholarship on Tolkien and racism for a couple of decades now, of which you may want to inform yourself before adding your own arguments, if you wish." Keep in mind, Holstetter has contributed to Tolkien's mailing list since 1990 and was contacted by Tolkien's son Christopher Tolkien to assist in publishing some of his father's texts. Imagine telling a man with 32 years' experience with Tolkien's work, who also worked directly with the man's son, that he needs to inform himself about Tolkien before opening his mouth. Now, a normal person would have just cussed them out, but Hostetter was so polite. Quote, "I am at least quite as familiar with everything Tolkien wrote, and with the particulars of his life and times, as the aforementioned scholars, and so at least quite as well equipped to form and explicate opinions on these and many other matters in Tolkien's studies. Thanks." He's so familiar with Tolkien that he wrote his response in Tolkien's voice. And then the authors just shut the fuck up, because what else were they gonna do? I mean, really, is this the best y'all can do? Try to change someone's work, and when challenged, claim racism, and when you can't prove it, keep moving the goalpost until you walk right into it all on your own? Here's a thought. If you want to see fantasy stories featuring non-white characters, adapt another story that features those characters. Every story doesn't have to fit your worldview, but if you are looking for those that do, there are plenty of them out there. Just adapt those and rid us of your stupidity. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.